Okay, this is roughly a continuation and a commentary on the last, especially the last 20 minutes of the last sort of 2 hour, 20 minutes upload that I made, which is titled something like Speculation on Borderline Therapy and contrasting it and discussing psychopathy. So, in the last 20 minutes, in some sense, I was not being technically direct about my terminology because in some sense I was talking about the glove, which the glove is like a metaphor of getting the ego function and the subconscious, the accountability and the responsibility sort of I- idealistically steelmanned into a robust and vital and a proper functioning, so essentially those two sections of the mind are are cleared up on a conceptual level in terms of what they're supposed to be able to perform. And then essentially the only remaining problem is that then you get the borderline that is in the process of rehabilitation who has produced such a glove won't actually use the glove and instead just sort of reverts to a juvenile narcissism in which they're just standing in the inner child and they're not stepping a foot into the subconscious, they're not touching the glove, and in some sense they asymmetrically leverage the concept of the glove as to everyone else is projected as needing to be bound by that code, and in some sense that's the complete inversion of the purpose of the glove, because the glove is that you do it and you wear it even if no one else does. In some sense it provides the protection that it provides by its adoption, not by its projective adoption uh, placed onto or overlaid onto everyone else. And so when they are doing this kind of asymmetrical projection where they don't use the gloves themselves, but other people use them themselves, then in some sense, that's a kind of truncated totemic conduit to reality, where essentially they are continuing to be borderline, just they don't have the totem that they use to sort of um, mediate between their influence over reality is just a simplified totem. It doesn't have the many faces. It just has a kind of it just has the kind of the base of the totem. It doesn't have and a singular inner child valence, which is like the juvenile narcissist. And so in some sense they're still fully borderline, just they have more internal stability in terms of the glass house um, thing, and in some sense they this is in fact a perfect description of the house of mirrors. This when you have this only the base of the totem, and you have a single inner child juvenile narcissism, in some sense this is actually another description of the house of mirrors. So this is actually just the house of mirrors phase, and you can see that essentially it is accomplished by creating a consolidated mode of the subconscious and the ego function, but then it becomes a projective mode, and that is what allows the internal stability and the house of mirrors to arise and supplant the glass house defense. So in some sense they can just be purely prospective in their manipulation. They don't have to sort of play a maneuvering game where they are sacrificing pieces on the chessboard and having to change their inner child valence, um, and weaving a thread of manipulation in between the kind of, because as I said, that a lot of the manipulation of borderline is not in the actual inner child valence that they're projecting, but it's between the valences. It's the hidden messages in the sequences of the valences, in the interchangeability of them. So it's not, and this is why a lot of their psychopathy goes unnoticed, because you are always dignifying the inner child as being um, a real actor, as being the real seat of consciousness, when it isn't. It's the ego function that is actually the seat of consciousness, and the inner child is just the patsy, is just the kind of the actor that then will take on another role and will project another subconscious mask, but that is a secondary Trojan horse for this for that cycling through the inner child valences that essentially are just there to confuse and confound and eventually wear down with essentially attrition, so that they can stably inhabit or get somebody else to sort of be roped into their subtextual moral subversion and disorientation, and make the other person's ego function codependent on them, essentially to rope them into, essentially they're kind of looking for something that's kind of like a psychopathic injury. They actually want to create a kind of psychopathic injury in which another person is compelled to reclaim the moral um, or to guard against the moral accusation which they are subtextually leveraging against them. And then what sort of pierces this game is when they actually voice their own ego function directly. Then you can tell that they know what it is that they're doing, that they're not just creating these moral hazards incidentally, that the moral hazard is the main vector of their manipulation and coercion, and the whole inner child gambit and pantheon and cycling through them is just subterfuge. Um, anyway, so so what I was basically describing in some sense was a practical example of how essentially if you were trying to rehabilitate a borderline and you got them to the point at which they had created the glove, but then they had essentially turned it into the house of mirrors, it's because essentially they're not using the glove. And then they are still essentially in some variant of essentially mimicking accountability but not responsibility, or mimicking responsibility and not accountability, depending on which side of the lake you want to reference it to. If you want to reference it to the inner child, or reference it to um, essentially the subconscious, although the subconscious is I think always a proxy for the ego function. That is just because in some sense and in some sense you can't also take the content of the subconscious. You have to take the abstract pattern of the subconscious, of what the subconscious content is driving towards. And so you have to kind of look past the actual brittle content, because that brittle content is just there to be a lure, is just there to hook you, and in some sense is also changing at quite a high rate, or its turnover is quite high. And in some sense, if you just focus on its content, you're going to be deluded. Um, Although it is slightly more stable in the House of Mirrors, but it's brittle in the sense of, in some sense, its content isn't even changing that much. Um, the style of its content is pretty stable, but the style of its content is completely unilateral and asymmetrical in that it is just reporting a reflection of the inner child. It is just so in some sense it's very present focused. It's very in the moment. So it's like, oh no, this is now the situation. This is now the situation. This is now the situation. They just keep on saying this is now the situation, and they're self-reporting it, and they're self-report, and so their feelings and their inner constitution, everything else must be reactive to it. There's no two-way street. So that becomes the vessel of their subconscious, is this brittle exposition of their internal state that other people are responsible for reacting to or catering to or honoring. So essentially, they're kind of like parasitic on the concept of bad faith, because they're constantly holding you to ransom, that, oh no, don't be in bad faith, you have to respond to what I'm saying, and stop criticizing me, stop getting in my head, stop telling me that I'm not that my style, don't invalidate my structure, my internal structure. That's private. So it's that kind of brittleness. So they're always on the edge of leveraging some new issue, some new concept, some new subject of conversation, which is laden heavily in framework, that essentially it's there to create a context which is completely unilaterally construed. There's no two-way street in constructing that context. That context is supplied by them, and it is modulated to some degree by other people, and that gives them a cue as to how to conduct the further elaboration of the framework. It's very one-sided, it's very unilateral. So and if you step out of being projected on in this way, or coerced in this way, then there's always a kind of moral defect that's attached to it, or a kind of it's weird, I guess. It's sort of because their inner child is this kind of nebulous juvenile narcissist. If you don't play along with it and honor it, then they are prone to sort of exporting a kind of narcissistic injury because of your non-compliance. So if your non-compliance means that essentially you own some kind of narcissistic injury, and that's a pure sort of projection on their that your inner child belief structures, or structures in general, are deficient because you can't keep up with them and their high functioning proficiency. And then essentially, and they underwrite this with a kind of ego function labeling system, which is very naive, which is it's in some sense, it doesn't look psychopathic. I mean, it's in the total structure it's psychopathic, but in some sense it's not overtly psychopathic, because it seems to be consistent. I mean, it's like delusional, it's confabulated, it's always in the moment. So in some sense their ego function is always just naively generating judgments in the moment. Its opinions are just fluid, organic opinions. And this is what gives it its brittle quality, that it can't be revised, it can't sort of be redirected, it can't take on anything, because it's not articulating the glove. It has created the glove metaphorically, but it's still praying to the totem, or worshipping the totem, or using the totem as the conduit for control of everything. And it's still solipsistically channeling the power of the totem, because it's not actually willing to put on the glove and to interact and negotiate through the glove. The glove is just lying there. So in some sense, the glove I've just showed that this is the general, I think, failure of therapy that would generally happen. That if you essentially that you would conceptually create something that would look something like the glove, but in some sense it was never the glove to begin with. You've just given them a kind of permission to get into a kind of meta discussion, which has given them the confidence to deploy the House of Mirrors. So they have now felt that they have a kind of cultural confidence to deploy the House of Mirrors, in that the glove becomes essentially part of the chessboard. And they don't have to play according to the rules. And in some sense, the rules are for other people, the rules are not for them, when it's actually supposedly, it should be the exact opposite. That you can't expect other people to play by the rules, but you play by the rules because the glove is good for you. It's the only way to actually interact with reality, but instead they're stuck in the House of Mirrors because that's that's all they've ever done, is essentially the kind of the idolatry of the totem, which has supplanted essentially their motivation to put any fidelity into the subconscious. So they still have this deep subconscious aversion, that essentially they've always wanted to access it, but they want to do it safely. So they need a totem, which essentially they can use if they can just get one other person to pray to that totem, then they can sort of use that, or they can extract worship from one other person, then they can use that other person as the bridge to the subconscious. So they're essentially they're trying to get people into a practical religion, into an idea, in the same way that Slavoj Žižek talks about ideology is something that you don't have to realize that you is your ideology for it to be your ideology. That's the kind of ideology that they are trying to incept into somebody else. They're trying to condition somebody else into being a totem um, zealot or conducive to that, but they are like the priestess. So they want to be the priestess of the totem, and they need a kind of subordinate clergyman or whatever that they have facilitated and initiated into this sort of. I mean, in some sense, they want the other person to be a kind of I can't think of the word, but like I had a good metaphor, but anyway, the word was a bit weird. But I guess like they want to be. They're just trying to find a henchman. They're just trying to find a sap um, who will really believe in their form and facilitate their form of solipsism in some sense. And they're not motivated to find an alternative. They really aren't, because at least hypothetically they have full access to the subconscious. They just need a bridge. They just need someone to enslave in order to facilitate that. And in some sense, uh, just like a psychopath, they don't really believe that the subconscious has any treasure, but they just want a presence there. I think they just want they want to feel like they're on top of it. So in some sense, it's like the psychopath can take a trip down to the kiddies pool. They don't the borderline doesn't even want to go. They want to send somebody else on their behalf, but they've got a telescope and they can still. But it's all just kiddies pools. But they just want to send someone out there who's got it covered or something like that. Um, and in some sense, that's proof that they've got complete control over everything. So in some sense, they're kind of like a domineering psychopath that they want every side of the mind covered. Um, and they have, if that is their overarching objective, that in some sense, I guess in some hypothetical conceptual sense, you could say, well, that envelops every other possibility. It's sort of like hypothetically, they've got everything covered. It is a kind of um, self. Uh, it is a form of a kind of metaphysical self-aggrandizement, because it's one thing to be a solipsist. It's another thing to like be grandiose in your solipsism in some sense. So I mean, I think it anyway. It might have there might be better descriptions to make of actually sort of the intrinsic metaphysic that this is all symbolic of. But anyway, I think I've yeah. So obviously, in what I was actually describing is not someone who has made the glove, someone who has made something that mimics making the glove, and in some sense they're just doing the same thing that they always do, which is um, create a semblance of either responsibility or accountability, but not have both simultaneously. Um, and when I say that, for example, that they need to make their own nurturing environment, what that means is that in some sense they have to see what it looks like to have that glove working. Well, I mean, yeah, the glove working itself is the ability, let's say, to be humble and wrong and revise, but keep reference of underwriting your past actions in some sense, that you are still on the hook for your past actions. um, that you can do whatever you can revise however you so wish, but in your revision you have to also still be on the hook for the things that you did before you revised. That's essentially the thing that gives you the permission to change and relabel in your subconscious context, is that you have to clean up your own messes in your past iterations. That gives you the latitude, that gives you the permission to have consistency when you revise, that you can essentially you're allowed to change, you're allowed to be different, you have that freedom, but the freedom doesn't come at the cost of consistency. And that is how essentially the ego function and the subconscious sort of stay in fidelity um, in both of their operations. And that is the grounding um, structure, which I think that they do have to master that first, because they are already a top-heavy structure. Their ego function is the seat of consciousness. Although they mimic, or part of that structure is to have a virtual inner child, which is um, usually in a state of whatever. I'm not describing that again, but the glass house defense and such, and a confusion of different valences. So and essentially this is the thing, is that they'll never actually exercise. Oh, I mean, well, when I say they'll never, I mean it's that's the binary choice. Will they choose to do something different? Will they choose to actually cross that Rubicon and actually take on that kind of persistent accountability and start exercising that freedom with that accountability attaching to it? Um, so that they have an active responsibility and a persistent accountability simultaneously. And that really is something that they actually have to have the will to change, or they have to motivate themselves to change. It can't be outsourced. You can't give them a description, and in some sense, it's impossible. You can't supplement for their lack of doing that. And so, in some sense, some version of the glass house. I mean, maybe they can slowly work towards it. In that, in some sense, I do think that it is a more stable structure if they get into a kind of if they get into the House of Mirrors. So if I just said glass house recently, I meant House of Mirrors. So essentially, if you can get them into a House of Mirrors, but then try to sort of equip them with skills, then in some sense those skills might act as a kind of two-way sword, in which they can't just leverage them asymmetrically, because they'll realize that essentially it doesn't work. But in some sense, this ups the ante, though, because they are very likely to reveal themselves to be psychopathic to people if they don't get balanced heuristics and balanced projections. It's in some sense, you know, it's always going to look unwieldy, because they're always expecting more from other people than they are expecting from themselves, and they're not expecting the same consistency from themselves as they are extracting it from other people. It looks very egregious. It looks overtly psychopathic. Um, I mean, there are functional borderlines who are in power structures who take on these characteristics, because when they have unquestioned authority and power, they can uh, they can move into this uh, 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 mode of operating. but it requires essentially a culture of asymmetry in order to facilitate its stability, or in order at least to mask its deeply pathological um, or psychological structure. In some sense, it might find a place in a certain kind of hierarchy, in a certain kind of context. Not go. It might not be a glaring pathological, form of delusional thinking in some sense. It just happens to mirror the internal dynamics in some sense. And um, the chess playing demon, as the metaphor that I use, if you're dealing in a bounded context that has very clear um, conditions, and it has a very clearly defined environmental structure, then perhaps it's good enough, in certain practical terms. But at least psychologically, it's as I've described it before, it is a form of solipsism. I think there's no way getting around that. Um, that the totem, the chessboard, is there, um, is essentially their internalized model of not only their inner child, their virtual inner child, which essentially, if they're in the house of mirrors, then essentially it's only the inner child, the virtual inner child, that is on their chessboard. So they're just maneuvering parts of self-description and self-reporting that other people have to react to. And so those internal self-descriptions become very philosophically infused, become very elaborated, become very grandiose in a sense, but they become rich in conditionalities of anticipation and expectation and bundles of description that attach to the self, because they are just revealing parts of themselves and then expecting a reaction to that, a mirrored reaction to that, and then depending on that, that'll decide what they tell next about themselves. And so they're controlling through a narrative about themselves. They are the center of that narrative. So they are just self-reporting a narrative, and then they just expect compliance, external compliance. By the way, you can see the huge mirrors between this and identity politics. This is exactly fascistic thinking at work. Um, that you just self-report about the identity, and then and then there must be an external response, or reagency, that essentially the self image is the catalyst, and the environment is the is prone to a kind of in a compulsive way to be sympathetic to the catalyst, and they are the only catalyst. There's and there's and that's the asymmetry essentially. That and again, the inner child is the totem, is the chessboard, is the um, obviously it's sort of, they're playing 3D chess in the sense of having a glass house, because if they're having a glass house, then they're actually having to sort of play chess with their inner child, but then that inner child isn't capable of controlling, so they have to cycle to a new valence of an inner child. They have a new iteration of an inner child, and they are not even trying to control with the inner child directly, but they're trying to control indirectly through the supposition and sequencing between the different inner child valences. So they're trying to left hook, right hook, jab, jab, from all coming from these different inner child valences that they're cycling between. um, that's in the glass house, but then in the house of mirrors, they're just expressing from this kind of translucent matrix of a kind of catalytic of this, because essentially they've worked out somehow that their inner child should be catalytic. Now you see, um, Okay, yeah. So I mean, look, there are lots of. Okay, I'm sort of repeating myself probably too much, but so what we're actually doing here is, I guess, if the borderline can actually understand this about themselves from a kind of uh, from a house of mirrors perspective, because that is the more stable. That's the closest you can sort of get to talking to the ego function, which is the actual substrate of the whole borderline structure. You have to sort of get it into um, getting its juvenile narcissism to change its basic constitution or its basic configuration. It has to change the character of that, the character of and essentially it has to change its character in order to marry with that glove, in order to articulate the glove, instead of just using the glove as part of the chessboard. So in some sense, the real rehabilitation of the borderline is the inner child. Obviously, you have to do that, but you have to do it through the gatekeeper of the ego function first, because otherwise that is just going to um, deride and dilute. So in some sense, you have to break down the ego function. The ego function has got a lot of things working in it, but basically it's a calcification of solipsism. So it's fundamentally going to not duplicate understanding. It's not going to responsibly take into account anything. It's fundamentally there to just continue to perpetrate its unilateral control and create iterations of contrivances and mimicry and but essentially, if it can conceptually have enough resources to know what the glove is, then you're just trying to motivate the inner child. Well, not, you can't motivate the inner child, but you're essentially trying to motivate the inner child to change itself, to change its constitution, to change its own character, and that's a choice. Or you have to show that there is such a thing as creating a new motivation, and that is a personal thing. That's something that you can't compel. That's something that you can sort of make a case, and essentially it's not a motivating case. It's just a descriptive case. That, well, if you do this, it leads to this, having this actual facility and dealing in reality. Otherwise, it's just more solipsistic self delusion, confabulated non-going exposure. And in some sense, if they have people around them that are capable of exposing themselves and being, let's say, the brunt of this kind of never-ending game of trickery and mimicry and kind of slavery to their to these structures, to these solipsistic structures, they don't really have a motivation to change. And this is the biggest thing that we have to understand, is that even as they might even fail, the hypothetical chance of success means that they never have to find a real alternative to the totem. So if they've conceptually got access to a universal solution to a universal problem, why would they ever shift away from it? I mean, you can say that essentially it's self delusional, but they've never articulated anything other than their self deluding bullshit. Um, so, I mean, they don't even have to think about it. They can stop themselves from thinking about it because that's what they've been doing their whole life, is being obsessed with just controlling. So, it's at some point the ball's in their court, and you can't give them an external motivation. You can give them a description as to what they're missing out on in some sense, or what they're doing to themselves, or something like that. You can try sort of, but in some sense, that's the point, is that they're not duplicating anything. They're not actually receiving information. They're receiving feedback on their chessboard. And if they want to interpret that a different way, beyond a chessboard, in a different kind of interface, in a real kind of interface in which they actually have fidelity in their subconscious, well, that's who knows if it'll even cross their mind, if it'll even come into their consideration. Um, I mean, there might be methods of imparting this. There might be. I mean, obviously, I'm giving an overview, but essentially, there might be more successful ways of demonstrating the logic in the next step in the chain, as it were. Um, as to like why, but in some sense, that's going to be a bit of a mystery. It's literally going to be a kind of mysterious process of therapy. Then that at certain points would be very clear about, well, this is the dilemma and these are the choices, and then you say, okay, well, actually that was the choice, but actually it was a greater choice because you couldn't even hear the full elaboration of what it is that was happening, and then you sort of move on. But it sort of, anyway. I mean, you can try to make the maze as let's say as perfectly gradient, um, a grade a not too steep gradient of progress, but at any point there's no well, at least at one point where there's no carrot that you can dangle in some sense, um, because the structure itself is a kind of self. As long as they've got parasitic, in some sense, I mean, it's a form of. See, it's not narcissistic supply in some sense. It's subconscious supply that is actually fueling them. And they can always extract it. They can always do something to extract attention. They can always create instability and chaos. And then they've got a kind of hypothetical invigoration of their structures, that there is hope that they can have a universal solution to their universal um, interface with reality, and that and just having some subconscious input means that essentially that they can believe that the chessboard is a totem worthy of worship, and that it does, um, and that it might give them the full control that they so wish, and they don't want anything less than the full control, because essentially then all they, I mean, it is a kind of religious, it is actually a structure of a kind of worship. It is the structure of a kind of theology. Um, it is a kind of solipsistic theology, and so it's self-satisfying in that context. And if you want to supplant that self-satisfying theology, I mean, well, it's very hard to at some point, you can try to create a gradient scale of where you're demonstrating that all of these things are improvements. I mean, perhaps, in some sense, you do have to work out a way of improving the behavior in such a sense that then they can, in their own experience, see that essentially crossing the Rubicon is not such a is just a difference of one of a few meters. It's not a it's not crossing a Rubicon. It's just crossing at a very small. So essentially, you can try to sort of. Uh, uh, okay, I've gone over, I think, the outline, the full outline of what a of what therapy, I guess, the dynamics and the problems and the proximate challenges that therapy would entail. Although obviously I haven't given practical guidelines or anything like that, but at least conceptually, I think I've outlined it all, and also better explain the internal workings of borderline as well. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to give a summarized overview after all that subject matter just to make sure that it's simplified. So, the first thing that has to happen is you have to get into a House of Mirrors scenario. Without the House of Mirrors, without bringing the situation up into the House of Mirrors situation, even the House of Mirrors situation is problematic from what we need to get from it in order to continue the rehabilitation. So, but without the House of Mirrors, there is no progress. It's not even possible, and I'll expand on that now. But so first of all, you need a House of Mirrors in order to conceptually or intellectually clear up the function of the ego function and the function of the subconscious to make it into the glove, the metaphorical glove. So you need to conceptually, intellectually get a model, get an understanding of how those things need to work together in some kind of ideal non-pathological form. You have to conceptually clean that up. And the only way to do that is in the House of Mirrors context, because if you're not in the House of Mirrors context, then you're just they are hearing it in the valence of a particular inner child, and that inner child is cycled out for a new inner child every 5 minutes, and so it retains nothing. It can just wipe its memory banks clean because they're just there for short spurts or whatever. So you need a persistent inner child in order to even have a hope of intellectually clearing up this issue. Right, now the problem is that even in the House of Mirrors, you're dealing with the brittle subconscious kind of structure. So there is no you're not even it's not even capable of penetrating into their understanding. Whatever you're saying to them, whatever you're saying to them, is happening on their unilateral terms. Is happening on their so in some sense already they have to have given some kind of pretext that they are actually invested in they have to ostensibly be following you or listening to you or absorbing something, but they're not really anyway. They're not actually absorbing it, but sort of by osmosis, you have to hope that eventually they get some kind of intellectual fathoming of this. The problem is that like even if they intellectually model it, it's sort of they don't even believe it themselves because in some sense they were just doing that as a medium to get their control, to get their it was just a mimicry. It was just a conduit of their outlaying of their manipulation essentially. So this is the problem: is that like there's no return address. It's essentially it's just a game to them. It's just part of the chessboard. So, but during the chessboard, you have to sort of and this is problematic because essentially they will use whatever it seems that they need to use in order to entract you into being exposed to their attrition. This is this is problematic because essentially they are the cat and you are the mouse, and they've got you in a maze, and somehow you have to use the maze to transmit information into something that they can actually retain. And then once they've perhaps got enough resources to make that glove, then they haven't probably made it. They're using it in their asymmetrical sense. They're projecting it onto other people. It belongs to everyone else but them, and they're still doing the chessboard stuff, so they're not using the glove. But in some sense, you have to, because essentially the words are hollow. All the words that you're using and that they're using, they're just conduits for their manipulation, for their coercion. It doesn't mean anything. There is no subconscious fidelity with them, right? The subconscious is just a brittle conduit to deploy their coercive control in some sense. But again, there is no you need to get them in some kind of persistent state so that they even have a chance of, let's say, absorbing or replicating this model within themselves, the model of the glove, as it were. So they have to have the possibility of constructing the glove, but they won't have made the glove yet. Then essentially, then I guess you have to title it that you're moving on to the next stage of rehabilitation, which is essentially, let's say, the lack of their fucking motivation. They just don't have the motivation to change. They don't, no matter what they say, their words are hollow. It's just mimicry. It's just, they will take whatever the game situation, whatever the scenario is, they will look like that they're playing along to it just to, it's just because they need a conduit in order to control somebody else's subconscious, in order to help them feel like they're in control of having a grandiose solipsism, you know. So you know, essentially, you know, when you're working on the inner child, actually reifying, that was a word that I actually wanted to use when I was describing some of this stuff. But anyway, again, anyway, that's taken out of context in this what I'm talking about now. But so essentially, then you're dealing with the inner child and their juvenile narcissism, which is essentially the conduit of their house of mirrors. And so, uh, and then essentially you have to basically get them to the Rubicon and get them to cross it, you know, and get them to sort of to switch gears, essentially to change their and to use the glove, to actually use the glove. So to actually demonstrate to them that they're not using the glove, I guess, although making that argument in some sense I think is somewhat feeble, because the words will just seep through them. It won't. Nothing will make contact, because they have one mode, and it is solipsistic manipulation, right? So what can you really do? You know, like because it's not like there's a different magical um, set of ingredient words that are going to sort of do the work. They have to actually do the work, and essentially they uh, whether they will or whether they won't, it's just up to them. So it's you know, but essentially without the persistence of a single sort of inner child, without the house of mirrors, there is no way for them to even retain that train of thought of actually sort of posing a different style of engaging. Because in some sense, then they have a persistent psychopathy that at least then. But I mean, I guess they're not even truthful about tracking it. So in some sense, although they are persistent in an active sense, they're not persistent in a referential sense to what it is that they are doing. So that's still sort of delusional land. That because essentially because they're not using the glove, they can just project every every problem they have. They can just invert it and project it onto the environment, onto the other people, onto some other sort of subconscious mask. And essentially, to me, this is why the intellectual work of the glove has to be worked out first. Essentially, that because what the glove is meant to symbolize in some sense is that damn, I just had it in my mind, is consistency, is internal consistency. That it is, and therefore you're not using the glove when you're projecting, because that's inconsistent, because you are expecting more from other people than you're even expecting from yourself, when actually you need to be in the reverse of that. You need to expect more from yourself than you do of other people. You need to have the highest standard for yourself and lesser standards for other people, and room for negotiation, and actually getting them to agree to involve themselves in obligations that you might want to impose on them. But for the borderline, it's the complete reverse. Everyone else has obligations and they have none. They have definitional freedom. They can push the reset button on their identity. because essentially they're just living in the now, and essentially what the House of Mirrors does in some sense is the reason why they can have a persistent in a child is because in some sense they don't keep tabs on it. They allow themselves that persistency because they don't give themselves any accountability, because they just live in the present in terms of, so they say, look, I'm being responsible, but they have no reference to what it is that they're doing. That's just constantly, that's like holding down the reset button on accountability, right? So they have this absolute continual reset button that they have the power and the leverage over exerting, and no and that is inconsistent because they don't give that power to anyone else. They only give it to themselves, and essentially only anyone else can prove that they're on the same level or on the same state if they exceed and ascend to the borderline perpetrating this asymmetry. They have to, in order to join the club, they have to already agree that asymmetry is, so that's why I call it a kind of theological kind of structure, cultural structure. And they are just merely trying to wear people down and give them injuries and erode them until they exceed to that. And essentially, it's a lack of introspection. It's a lack of being honest about these internal structures, which they don't want to confront because then they would actually reveal the choice of doing something different, I guess. And so then they will just continue to pass it off as somebody else's deficiency, and there's nothing stopping them from doing that. Okay, so until they actually see that as a choice that they are actively perpetrating and stop it, and then do the thing where they actually impose restrictions on themselves, which would actually give them a persistent accountability, give them a persistent reality, which means of doing the extra work of curating their own inner child belief and structures, and being the guarantor of their of if they give dividends or not. So they actually have to be on the hook in terms of their subconscious expression. They actually have to, they can't just out exteriorize it. They can't just outsource the accountability onto a system. Now that is obviously a very scary proposition because the one is a perfect prediction machine in which you can regulate everything and you can anticipate everything hypothetically, and the other one is something in which you might fail. And they have essentially completely eroded the chance that they put anything on the line because they're just playing this chess game in which they have asymmetrical rules. So, you know, this is the problem, is that, like, the motivation to switch modes or to change your constitution or to change this characterological structure is essentially the allowance of a kind of infallibility, of a susceptibility, of a vulnerability, or a, and essentially that's what they were looking for in a host, in a target, in a compatriot, in a sympathizing slavery of some kind of you know they needed somebody else's identity enslaved to this project in order to allow them to perpetrate this kind of invulnerability, um, because this brittle invulnerability as well that has these internal sophisticated ways of breaking down and being problematic. But in some sense, the hope was always just to continue to exteriorize that into the ether, into the system. Again, you can see the parallel between this and identity politics. Um, you can see the parallel between this and the fascistic conception of society, and the identity matrix, and modeling the world in this kind of self-image. Um, it just needs a conduit. It just needs a Führer. It needs a savior to be the pansy, or to be the complicit, paternalistic hidden hand that sort of does the butler work for the identity. Um, it's this stuff that I wish how is this ever going to get into the political arena in order to clean things up in the dismal state of doom spiral that it is engaged in at the moment. Anyway, that's a tangent to this. But anyway, so this is the thing, is that as a narrative, as a narrative system, it is complete. So the question is, does it want to become more than just a narrative system, purveying this narrative and using this narrative as its own currency to enforce compliance and through a kind of currency of sympathetic of a kind of intellectual sympathy enforcement of reacting to its pure states of self-reporting, so it can just sort of self-report reality into unfolding. And this is anyway. There's no point in describing it and trying to get into details. The point is that they have to essentially choose one bundle of affairs for another, and if they make that shift, well, I mean, there's no way to engineer it. It's up to them, and it is, in essence, this whole structure is born out of a lack of motivation to be a mortal proponent, or a or to negotiate with the rest of them, to have to engineer, to actually have to make your own reality in a non in a non ironclad, you know. I mean, if I finish that sentence properly, I have to make a whole lot of complicated additions, which I don't want to get into. But essentially, there are problems. I mean, essentially, it's like they wanted to make their own imagination reality, and the problem is that imagination itself, if used, is very much the same as hypotheticals. Hypotheticals have to be used responsibly, but they wanted to use the imagination without any kind of responsibility. They wanted to use a kind of hypothetical machine without any kind of responsible self-limitation. And so, because they've done that, they are creating these internal problems, which then it's not a problem necessarily for them, because they can just continually outsource that. They can just continue to fudge more of the structure in order to I mean, it's a very imbalanced, dysfunctional structure that, if it wants to continue to operate, is sort of I mean, toxic is not a bad analogy. Which, in some sense, it shows how, in some sense, it does have a fidelity to its own dysfunctional structure, in that it's looking for a codependent vessel that can absorb its incongruency, to sort of be the self-limiting facilitator, where it has to absorb the imagination, and it has to compute to sort of best fit self-limitation that it has to orchestrate on its own steam in the background and get no thanking for it, and just sort of it has to just facilitate. It's like the Lolita, um, the Lolita movie based on the Lolita book by well, the movie directed by Kubrick. That it's that kind of pandering, it's that kind of catering, it's that kind of, in the same relationship that the Führer has to the identity, in the fascistic mythos. Um, anyway, and then you get these pseudo intellectuals who think that they're so clever because they can help to facilitate and dress it up and dignify all these rational alignments that need to come into alignment in order to validate this rotten internal structure, in helping it to export its internal dissonance and incongruity, and it becomes this. I mean, I mean, in some sense, it has to have the very brittle kind of, it's like the geopolitics. I mean, this is a metaphor, but it's like the geopolitics of Nazi philosophy, that you would have all these different ethno-states that would not be directly involved in each other, but they are sort of like in this cold war that sort of keeps them on their toes, and of being overtaken by these outsiders, by these others that are kind of latent. Anyway, this is too tangential, and this is more relevant from a political standpoint than a psychological one. But in some sense, that's the only way to solidify the domain of the borderline, is to somehow say, well, everyone else is doing it anyway. That this is the game that everyone else is playing, and if I cede this ground, then other people will take my territory, and everyone else is already in this rotten economy, in this rotten intellectual economy, or in this rotten game, and so I can't stop playing it in some sense, because then the idea is that other people will cheat me and I won't be able to cheat them back, or something like that. So that's the sort of overarching rationalization and excuse of it. You can see. I mean, this is why, at least why, in the tradition of the left, fascists were always described as reactionaries, as the utmost reactionary. This is what it means to be reactionary, is that you accuse your enemy of doing what it is that you are trying to perpetrate. You use what your enemy is doing as an excuse to mirror them. It's ironic also that, I mean, this is a political aside, that, for example, all the accusations that the Germans made against the Jews, if you abstract those accusations, they're exactly what was facilitated by the Nazi regime. That's exactly the kind of things that the Nazi regime implemented on a systematic level. That the kind of control, the kind of infiltration, the kind of subversive, uh, insidious, mind warping indoctrination and such. It's quite ironic how it is exactly what it professes to defend against. Um, it's just, the kind of, with the window dressing. Oh, I'm doing it for good intentions as opposed to bad intentions. It's like it's that kind of juvenile labeling that just sort of saves it. And so that's why it has to have such control over the semantic um, expression of things. It sort of It labels things into reality, and that's how it also selectively regulates its this project, which essentially never ends, and it continues to double down. Again, making, I guess, more parallels that are perhaps more prescient in the political realm. Um, but yeah, we are embroiled in this borderline hybridized culture, politics, and just as before, it comes from the well, fascism clothes itself in whatever it seems, whatever looks popular. But it's as a mind virus, as a you know, it is roughly the borderline model. Although I've got other recordings that specifically go into that, but yeah. I mean, I guess it's hard because even on the political ideology thing, it's like people don't want to drop the ideology because it's like, well, it's so convenient. It tells you the answer to every problem. It gives you a simplified model of the world, an oversimplified model of the world, but essentially, it's that model has so much power. Why would you ever drop it in some sense? Because it's so convenient, and this is the problem. Um, is that if you go to another form of politics, if you regress or if you move back from this model, um, you have less hypothetical authoritarian reach of your intellect, your armchair intellect, which has this weird kind of relativistic paradox, which is where are you judging it from? Somehow, you're drenched in this relativistic subjectivity that you're leveraging, and somehow you also are narrating the system. What gives you the resource to do that? How do you see outside the system? But everyone else must play their role in your narrated script. It's fucking disgusting. The asymmetry, the inconsistency, and the only way that they excuse this is they say, well, we are being oppressed, so we are allowed to make the specious argument. So we have the power to construct specious arguments, and no one else does. And we can make the calculations of the hypothetical damages that are contrasted against some counterfactual, which they are allowed to imagine, but no one else is allowed to imagine counterfactuals to leverage against them because they wouldn't be able to compete. But their whole edifice is built on that asymmetry, is built on that cherry-picked, disgusting form of pseudo-intellectual argumentation. Um, and this is why, I mean, fascism has always had this dark appeal, and there always have been these natural fascists. I mean, these pseudo intellectual borderline people who get into public life, who leverage, these kinds of polemics and these kinds of conventions, and they are basically disgusting racialists. But now they have taken over academia, they have taken over departments, they've taken over the study of history, they've taken over in sociological departments. um, they must be removed, or we're just going to continue to slide into more race and gender studies, which is an obvious parallel to Aryan studies in Weimar Germany. The only difference is they've supplanted racial superiority with moral superiority and a canonical historical interpretation in which people belong to their group identity. And so they've got the same fascistic mythology. It's constructed in a slightly different way. Instead of racial superiority, it's moral superiority, but you still inherit your, just as you genetically would inherit your superiority, you historically inherit your moral superiority. So how does it function any differently? It's not. It's de facto exactly the same rehashed Nazi philosophy. Um, and it also gives the power of unaccountability. This is the problem: is that it gives political leadership a form of invulnerability in the same way that the borderline is invulnerable to accountability, because they can just leverage the cherry-picked description of the narrative and the polemic, and they can use the generalization against other people, but then they can have no generalizations leveraged back at them that they have to defend, because then they can just essentially threaten a kind of hysterical breakdown, or sort of impose a kind of collective guilt or collective shame in order to control that framing, So you can see that this is the same politically. Yeah, so the political arena has has the cultural hegemon has shifted into this borderline configuration, this borderline structure, which is obviously very dangerous. The last time this happened, so I mean, I always just say we are in the 1920s culturally. That's where we are. We're in the sort of, maybe in the very early 1920s, perhaps that's where we are right now. And the question is, can we get the race and gender studies out of the academy? Can we reverse the fascistic corrosion and corruption? Can the Constitution be unbetrayed? Can it be unfucked? Can it be can it be resuscitated? Because it has been killed already. It is dead. It has been betrayed by the Chief Justice himself, who also, that's a political problem. How does that get removed? In some sense, the open liberal society, the democratic values have all been betrayed and have gone undefended. And how do you revive these institutions? I mean, perhaps it's not possible under the current climate. I mean, obviously, technically, there would be formally there would be ways to do it, but I don't see the political will. I don't see the campaigning, the platforming, the polemic, leveraging this. And even if it was, what would the success be? But I mean, I think it must be attempted. Well, ideally, it should be attempted, at least as a historical landmark, as a way to say, look, it was being confronted, it was being contested in the starkest terms. That the truth was a candidate in the race of anyway.